Alright guys, so this is part 2 of the War on Terror project. This is about linkage institutions. Now, linkage institutions include the media, political parties, special interest groups, and the most common of all, which are elections. What linkage institutions essentially do is connect the people with their government. There are hundreds of millions of Americans, but there's only a few hundred members of the federal government at the top. So in order to do that, we need to find ways to connect us. We need to do this through media, we need to do this through elections and political parties, and through special interest groups, which are a little less uncommon than the rest of them, but nonetheless they work. Now we're going to have to see how this connects to our public policy choice, which was the War on Terror. So, in terms of the War on Terror, we can see that back around in 2001, so this is in the very beginning, we're right after 9/11, we can see that public trust amongst the party in power, which was President Bush and the Republican Party, was pretty high. It was at 50%, which is pretty high for party approval because there's only really two real parties we have. And then the Democrats were all the way down to 31%. And his approval and the government's approval in terms of fighting terrorism and other military threats, it stayed high, but it started to decrease as the United States, just like Vietnam, we got involved for a longer period of time in the Iraq quagmire, and eventually it just ended up as an epic fail. And you failed when the opposite party, the Democratic Party, is looking better than you in terms of military and foreign policy and protecting the country against terrorism. This is also the time where President Bush lost dramatically in the midterm elections due to historic unpopularity. This was before the recession, and this was primarily due to his failure in Iraq. As you can see, when President Obama took office, it was mild. People were about the same. And then eventually what happens is later on in his term, more than likely in his second term, we can see right here just when bin Laden was killed, it was tied. Public approval was tied. And then we can see as we go on, Alright guys, so we're going to be doing linkage institutions. This is part 2 of our public policy project in terms of the War on Terror. So linkage institutions essentially connect their people with their government. There's 320 million Americans. There's 535 members of the legislative branch. There's the president, and then there's the Supreme Court. We don't have that much connection to the top. But in order to do that, we have institutions in place that weren't established necessarily by the Constitution, but were inherently created, such as the media, such as political parties, such as special interest groups. And the only one that actually was guaranteed by the Constitution was obviously elections. So regarding our policy, which is the War on Terror, we can see the evolution since the beginning of the War on Terror all the way until the current year of how the public sees different political parties, the two political parties, in terms of their management of the War on Terror and just fighting terrorism in general and dealing with military threats. So you can see that at the beginning of the War on Terror, around 2002, 2003, same time Homeland Security and all of the apparatus came into play, the Republicans had a higher approval rating in terms of dealing with foreign policy and military threats, terrorism, and this was obviously President Bush was in charge at the time. But as we can see throughout his terms and towards the end of his term, and this was right before the recession, this is not when the recession hits in, we can see that his approval rating, his party's approval rating, has dipped below the Democratic Party's approval rating in terms of dealing with foreign military threats and terrorism. And the reason for that was we got bogged down in Iraq, and it became historically unpopular. People did not like it. People wanted to get the hell out of the Middle East, and this is really This was also the time that he lost historically in the midterm elections. Now, as we can see, as we go on into the Obama presidency, the opposite effect takes place. We can see between 2011 and 2013, it's 45-45, it's tied. That's when bin Laden was killed. So people had a high approval of President Obama in terms of, managing terrorism at that point. But as we go on, what we see is a drastic increase in Republican support of dealing with military threats, and that's primarily because due to the rise of ISIS around this time period and President Obama's second term, something we went over in our previous video. And essentially, people lose trust in the Democratic Party. It drops to a historic low. You see that 55-32 in between. That's probably somewhere 2014 when ISIS came to power. And the gap starts to close, but Republicans still maintain a comfortable lead in terms of protecting the country from external threats. So this is in relation to political parties. But in order to make these changes, we obviously have elections. So elections are used to influence the government, and they're basically made to make changes like these as seen on the graph, changes in power depending on which way the country is going. So, in terms of the war on terror, it started off just with Afghanistan, and it later went into Iraq, but people eventually saw what was essentially happening, and people were afraid of essentially getting involved in a longer, bogged down war. It's not like World War II where it's all glory and it's straightforward. Terrorism is very complex. It's all around the globe. It's terrorist networks. It's not like just buying war bonds or whatever. It's much more complicated. It's much more long. There's not a comfortable, happy conclusion. And basically a large fear in terms of the war on terror, which still continues today, people are hoping that it wraps up, is war with Iran. Now, Iran, it blocked it, but you can see the poster. This is a special interest group. These are people who obviously are trying to save the Iran deal. And essentially what the Iran deal was made by President Obama in 2015 to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons and producing nuclear weapons. And essentially that deal was abandoned by the United States in 2018 by President Trump. People are afraid of war with Iran because Iran's not like Iraq. Iran is much bigger. It's much more capable militarily of causing harm. And these special interest groups, in terms of the war on terror, just want it to come to an end. That's essentially what they're lobbying for. And in terms of the media, so the media was a major factor in the lead-up in the post 9/11 era, especially with our war on terror, but also in previous wars like World War II, World War I, the early days of Vietnam, the Gulf War, obviously, that was a very big one, and it was a very successful one in terms of the military and the media. But in terms of the lead-up to the Iraq War and the war on terror, the media played a fundamental role, and they're often criticized for it later on in the decade, but essentially they used the fear of 9/11 to drive the drums of war, and it was essentially done in this way to boost both their ratings and gain approval from the government. And that'll be all for today. Thank you.